Major Stefan Kowalski stood motionless in the crowded Allied Prisoner Release Center near Frankfurt on May 15, 1945. Rain pattered against the wooden barracks as an American officer handed him discharge papers and ration tickets. "You are free to go home now," the commander announced with a smile that suggested this was the happiest day of the Polish officer's life. But Kowalski's face remained impassive, betraying nothing of the storm raging within. What the American officer could not understand, what no one who hadn't lived through the nightmare of Poland's dismemberment could possibly comprehend, was that the very concept of home had become a cruel illusion. Around him, dozens of other Polish POWs exchanged knowing glances. Freedom, after 6 long years of war, had arrived bearing an impossible question: return to a homeland now under Soviet control, or begin life anew as a permanent exile? What Kowalski witnessed in that moment defied 6 years of hope that had sustained him through captivity. The realization that liberation would not mean restoration. His Poland, the independent republic he had sworn to defend, existed now only in memory. "My home is gone," he whispered to the Polish captain beside him. "Stalin has it now." The American officer, noticing their hesitation, repeated himself more slowly, assuming a language barrier. "You're free. You can go home." Kowalski nodded politely, clutching papers that granted him permission to return to a place that no longer existed in any meaningful way. The documents in his trembling hands represented the cruelest irony of the war's end: official authorization to return to a nation whose borders, government, and very identity had been erased and redrawn by foreign powers. He was being released into a freedom that offered no sanctuary. On that rainy spring day, Kowalski joined the ranks of what would eventually number over 200,000 Polish servicemen and displaced civilians facing the same impossible choice. These men had fought on the Allied side against Nazi Germany, many having escaped the initial defeat of Poland in 1939 to continue the struggle from exile. They had served in the Polish armed forces in the West, the Polish underground state, various resistance movements, and even in forced conscription under German occupation. They had endured prison camps, forced labor, battlefield horrors, and years of separation from loved ones, all sustained by the dream of returning to a free Poland. Now victory had brought not restoration, but a new occupation. The Soviet Union, having entered eastern Poland as part of the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact up in 1939, had no intention of relinquishing these territories. More disturbing still, their Western allies, Britain, France, and the United States, had effectively sanctioned this new reality at the Yalta Conference. The painful truth confronting men like Kowalski transcended mere border adjustments. Poland had been physically shifted westward, losing its eastern territories to the Soviet Union while gaining former German lands in the west. The Polish government in exile in London, which had directed resistance efforts throughout the war, was being delegitimized in favor of the Soviet-backed Polish Committee of National Liberation. Reports filtering through to POW camps told of arrests, disappearances, and executions of Home Army members and other non-communist resistance fighters who had returned. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, had established operations throughout Polish territory, methodically eliminating potential opposition to communist rule. For Polish officers especially, these reports carried existential weight. They remembered all too well the discovery in 1943 of mass graves in the Katyn forest containing the bodies of over 22,000 Polish military officers and intelligentsia prisoners executed by Soviet authorities in 1940. Despite Soviet denials and attempts to blame the Germans, many Poles knew the truth. The Katyn massacre stood as a grim warning of what might await returning Polish military personnel, particularly those who had served under the London-based government in exile or had anti-communist sympathies. This was the context in which Major Kowalski and countless others confronted their moment of technical freedom. Throughout the final months of World War II and into the immediate post-war period, similar scenes played out across hundreds of POW camps. displaced person centers, and military demobilization points throughout Europe. Polish servicemen listened to Allied officers explain repatriation procedures with growing dread, knowing they faced not a homecoming, but a potentially fatal political test. Those with families in eastern Poland, territories now incorporated into the Soviet Union, faced additional complications. Their hometowns were literally no longer in Poland. Others feared that family members might face persecution if they themselves were labeled as Western collaborators for having fought with Allied forces. The Western Allies found themselves in a diplomatic quandary. Having agreed to Soviet demands at Yalta concerning Poland's future, they were now facilitating the return of Polish soldiers to a political situation many of these same soldiers considered a betrayal. By early 1945, the Polish armed forces under Western command numbered approximately 250,000 personnel, constituting the fourth largest Allied army. These forces had distinguished themselves in numerous campaigns, most notably at Monte Cassino, Falaise, Arnhem, and in the Battle of Britain, where Polish pilots accounted for approximately 12% of Luftwaffe aircraft shot down during the most critical phase. Now these same heroes faced the prospect of returning to a homeland where their service might be viewed as treason. Initial Allied policy, driven by diplomatic agreements with the Soviet Union and practical considerations about the millions of displaced persons requiring resettlement, favored repatriation. British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden assured Parliament that Poles would return to a free and independent Poland. Yet, as reports of NKVD activities in Poland proliferated, coupled with the arrest of 16 Polish underground leaders who had been invited to negotiations with Soviet authorities, Allied enthusiasm for forced repatriation waned. By July 1945, the British government acknowledged the dilemma, with Prime Minister Winston Churchill admitting in Parliament, His Majesty's government cannot force them to return to Poland if they do not wish to do so. Major Kowalski's personal calculus that rainy day near Frankfurt reflected the agonizing decision, confronting his compatriots. He had last seen his wife and 7-year-old daughter in Warsaw in September 1939. His subsequent letters had gone unanswered after 1941. Were they alive? Had they been deported to the Soviet interior like thousands of other Polish families? Or had they perished in the systematic destruction of Warsaw following the 1944 uprising, when German forces had razed nearly 85% of the city? Even if they had survived, returning to them might mean subjecting himself to a political system that viewed his military service as ideologically suspect. The Americans, offering him freedom, could not comprehend that for him and many others there was no clear path home that didn't lead through potential imprisonment, forced labor camps, or execution. As the weeks passed after Germany's surrender, Polish POWs and displaced persons gathered whatever information they could about conditions in their homeland. Clandestine networks of compatriots shared letters, newspaper clippings, and first-hand accounts from those who had returned, only to flee again westward. In displacement camps across Germany, Austria, Italy, and France, Polish communities became information exchanges where the cost and benefits of repatriation were endlessly debated. Some chose return despite the risks, driven by family ties, lack of alternatives, or even ideological sympathy with the new regime. Others began planning for permanent exile, looking toward possibilities in Britain, France, the United States, Canada, Australia, and various South American countries. Captain Tadeusz Nowak, formerly of the Polish Second Corps that had fought in Italy, sat in a displaced persons camp near Naples in June 1945, carefully reading a smuggled letter from his cousin who had returned to Krakow. "The Russians are everywhere," the letter stated in deliberately vague language designed to evade censors. "Old friends are taking extended vacations eastward. Think carefully before coming to the family reunion." Nowak understood the code. Former resistance members were being arrested and deported to Siberia. His service with forces commanded by General Władysław Anders, a staunch anti-communist, would make him an immediate target. Similar calculations occurred in military hospitals where wounded Polish soldiers confronted additional complications. Lieutenant Jan Wojcik, recovering from injuries sustained during the Gothic Line campaign in Italy, discussed options with fellow patients at a British military hospital in Surrey. "They're offering me a medical discharge and repatriation," he told his roommate. The British doctor called it compassionate return because of my leg. He doesn't understand I might be trading this hospital bed for a prison cell, or worse. For men like Wojcik, physical disability compounded the challenges of exile, making the promise of returning home even more tempting despite the dangers. By autumn 1945, as the Allied powers moved from emergency post-war measures toward more permanent policies, the situation for Polish military personnel and displaced civilians crystallized into several distinct paths. The newly established communist government in Warsaw, recognizing the propaganda value of returning veterans, issued amnesty declarations promising safe return with no repercussions for military service abroad. Simultaneously, Soviet authorities intensified pressure on Western governments to facilitate repatriation of all Polish nationals. Yet reports from those who had returned early painted a starkly different picture from official assurances. Former Sergeant Kazimierz Makowski had returned to his hometown near Lublin in August 1945, one of the first waves of repatriates. His military service with Polish units under British command initially earned him celebratory welcome from neighbors, but within 2 weeks he was summoned for routine registration with local authorities. This began a series of increasingly hostile interrogations about his activities abroad, the names of his commanding officers, and whether he had had contact with Polish government-in-exile officials. After his third interrogation, Makowski realized his situation was deteriorating. Using family connections, he obtained false papers and fled to Gdansk, where he worked under an assumed name until securing passage on a Swedish merchant vessel. By December 1945, he had made his way back to a displaced persons camp in Germany, where his accounts of conditions in Poland circulated rapidly among those still weighing their options. Makowski's experience was far from unique. Throughout 1945 and 1946, a steady stream of re-escapees arrived in Western zones with similar stories. Former Lieutenant Antoni Lewandowski had returned to Warsaw in October 1945 after 3 years as a German POW. Within a month, he was arrested by the UB, Urząd Bezpieczeństwa, the Polish Communist Security Service, on charges of anti-state activities based solely on his previous service in units loyal to the London government in exile. After 6 weeks of interrogation and physical abuse, he was released with orders to report weekly to local authorities. Sensing his situation would only worsen, Lewandowski made contact with underground networks still operating along the new boundaries and escaped to the American zone in Germany. These first-hand accounts transformed the abstract political concerns many Polish servicemen harbored into concrete evidence justifying their reluctance to return. Western authorities, particularly British officials responsible for the largest contingents of Polish forces, found themselves navigating increasingly complex moral, political, and practical considerations. By late 1945, approximately 100,000 Polish military personnel under British command had expressed unwillingness to return to Poland. This created not only a diplomatic problem with the Soviet Union and the Warsaw government, but also a significant logistical and financial challenge. The Polish Resettlement Corps, established by the British government in May 1946, represented one attempt at addressing this dilemma. This unique formation, neither fully military nor civilian, was designed to facilitate the transition of Polish armed forces personnel to civilian life in Britain or elsewhere. Through this program, Polish servicemen received language training, vocational education, and temporary housing while retaining many aspects of their military structure and identity. For men like Major Kowalski, who had ultimately decided against return to Poland, the Resettlement Corps offered a path to rebuild some semblance of life from the ruins of exile. Yet, even as formal programs developed to address the Polish military diaspora, the fundamental human tragedy remained. Homes, families, and entire communities had been irretrievably lost. Captain Alexander Wasilewski, formerly of the Polish 1st Armored Division that had fought in Normandy and the Low Countries, expressed this loss in a letter to a fellow officer in December 1946. I received confirmation last week that my parents' farm near Lwow is now part of a Soviet collective. The new occupants are Russian settlers brought in after my family was deported to Kazakhstan in 1940. My brother died there in 43. My sister was last seen near Arkhangelsk. Even if Poland were truly independent, my home no longer exists. The Americans and British cannot grasp that for me, freedom to go home is meaningless. There is no home. This sentiment, the profound understanding that home had become an abstraction rather than a physical destination, permeated Polish exile communities. Practical concerns about political persecution merged with deeper questions of identity and belonging. If Poland itself had been fundamentally altered, its territory shifted, its political system imposed from outside, its society traumatized by successive occupations, was return even conceptually possible? Many concluded it was not, at least not to any Poland they recognized as their homeland. The Western Allies, while sympathetic to this dilemma, were also pragmatically focused on post-war reconstruction and emerging Cold War realities. As 1946 progressed, pressure mounted to resolve the Polish problem one way or another. The United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, and several other nations gradually developed immigration policies specifically addressing Polish military personnel and displaced civilians. The U.S. Displaced Persons Act of 1948 would eventually provide pathways for approximately 140,000 Poles to immigrate to America. For those who chose not to return, the path forward involved reconstructing lives and identities in entirely new contexts. Lieutenant Janusz Kowalczyk, who had flown with the Polish 303rd Fighter Squadron during the Battle of Britain, settled in Nottingham, England, initially working in a textile factory despite his distinguished military record. The first years were the hardest, he later recalled. Not just the physical conditions or the language barrier, but the psychological adjustment. Every night I dreamed of Warsaw, of my street, my family's apartment. Then I would wake up in a rooming house in England, surrounded by strangers, working a job I would never have imagined for myself before the war. We weren't just rebuilding lives. We were creating entirely new identities. The psychological impact of this forced reinvention manifested in various ways across the Polish diaspora. Some embraced their new circumstances with determination, focusing on education, career advancement, and integration into their adopted societies. Others maintained an almost religious devotion to the idea of eventual return, creating elaborate Polish cultural institutions in exile to preserve what they considered authentic national identity, untainted by communist influence. Major cultural and political organizations like the Polish Library in Paris, the Polish Institute and Sikorsky Museum in London, and the Polish-American Congress in the United States became repositories of this exile. Identity, what some scholars would later term Poland abroad, while the majority of Polish military personnel ultimately chose not to return. Approximately 120,000 did repatriate between 1945 and 1948. Their experiences varied widely. Some, particularly those with clear communist sympathies or from working-class backgrounds, found genuine opportunities in the new system. Others, especially those with pre-war connections to nationalist or democratic political movements, faced surveillance, discrimination, and, in many cases, eventual arrest. By 1949, thousands of repatriated servicemen had been imprisoned on various political charges, with hundreds receiving long sentences in labor camps. Exact numbers remain difficult to establish due to the secretive nature of communist security operations. but estimates suggest between 7,000 and 12,000 repatriated military personnel experienced some form of political persecution upon return. The story of Captain Michał Zielinski illustrates the treacherous uncertainty that awaited returning personnel. A former artillery officer who had fought at Monte Cassino with the Polish Second Corps, Zielinski repatriated in August 1946 after receiving assurances through the Polish Red Cross that his wife and children in Poznan needed him. Initially left unmolested, he found work as a bookkeeper in a state-run factory. For 18 months, he believed he had successfully reintegrated. Then, in February 1948, during the communist consolidation of power, he was arrested during a midnight raid on his apartment, charged with maintaining contact with imperialist intelligence services based solely on letters he had exchanged with former comrades who remained in England. He received a 12-year sentence after a 3-hour closed trial. Released during the 1956 political thaw following Stalin's death, he emerged from prison to find his wife had divorced him under pressure, and his children had been taught to view him as an enemy of the people. Not all returnees faced such dramatic persecution. More common was a subtle but pervasive discrimination in employment, education, and housing. Former Lieutenant Witold Adamski, who had served in the Polish Air Force under RAF command, returned to Poland in early 1946 and sought to resume his pre-war career as an engineer. Despite his qualifications, he found himself repeatedly passed over for professional positions, instead offered only manual labor. After several months of increasing frustration, a sympathetic manager privately explained the situation. "Your service abroad is a black mark in your file. They'll never trust you with anything important." This pattern of professional limitation and social marginalization became the quiet punishment for many who had chosen to return. For those who remained in exile, the pain of separation from homeland was compounded by survivors' guilt and concern for those left behind. Former Corporal Stefan Wróblewski settled in Manchester, England, spent over 30 years working as a machinist while dedicating evenings and weekends to the Polish Ex-Combatants Association, which maintained contact with veterans who had returned to Poland. "We send packages with coffee, chocolate, medicines, things they cannot get there," he explained in a 1970 interview. "It's not just the material help. It's letting them know they haven't been forgotten. Many of us wonder if we made the right choice. Would it have been better to return and suffer alongside our countrymen rather than live in relative comfort abroad? There's no answer to that question." This ambivalence about the choice between return and exile persisted throughout the Cold War period, as conditions in Poland fluctuated with political changes from the harsh Stalinist era of the late 1940s and early 50s to the comparative liberalization under Władysław Gomułka after 1956, through the economic stagnation of the 1970s and the solidarity movement of the 1980s. Exiles reassessed their decisions. Some, particularly after political amnesties in 1956 and again in the 1970s, did eventually return, often as elderly pensioners seeking to spend their final years in familiar surroundings. Others maintained their exile identity to the end, creating distinct Polish communities throughout the Western world. The particular tragedy of the Polish military exile was that it occurred not in defeat, but following Allied victory. These men had fought on the winning side, contributed significantly to the Nazi defeat, yet found themselves unable to enjoy the freedom they had helped secure. Lieutenant Colonel Jerzy Pajączkowski, addressing a gathering of former Polish airmen in London on the 20th anniversary of VE Day, captured this bitter irony. "We defeated Hitler only to lose Poland." The peculiar mathematics of this war meant that our military victory translated into national defeat. We are living monuments to that contradiction, free men who cannot go home. These contradictions extended beyond individual experiences to shape international relations throughout the Cold War. Western democracies, particularly the United States and Britain, maintained formal diplomatic relations with the communist government in Warsaw while simultaneously recognizing, at least symbolically, the legitimacy of Polish exile communities and their cultural institutions. This dual-track approach reflected the uncomfortable compromises of post-war geopolitics, where practical accommodation of Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe coexisted with rhetorical commitment to eventual liberation. The Polish government in exile, which had directed resistance efforts throughout the war from London, continued to function as a symbol of constitutional continuity even after Britain officially recognized the Warsaw Government in July 1945. Although increasingly marginal to international politics, this exile government maintained a president, cabinet, and diplomatic representatives until 1990, when it formally transferred its insignia of office to Lech Wałęsa, following Poland's first post-communist free elections. For many Polish exiles, particularly military veterans, this shadow government represented the legitimate continuation of the pre-war republic and provided a framework for their political identity abroad. As decades passed, the Polish military diaspora established distinct patterns of adaptation in various host countries. In Great Britain, where approximately 140,000 Poles settled following the war, Polish ex-servicemen often clustered in specific industrial regions where labor was needed during post-war reconstruction. Cities like Manchester, Bradford, and Coventry developed substantial Polish neighborhoods centered around Polish Catholic parishes, Saturday language schools for children, and veterans clubs. These communities maintained strong internal cohesion while gradually integrating economically into British society. In the United States, which eventually became home to the largest number of post-war Polish emigrants, patterns varied by region. Chicago, with its already substantial pre-war Polish-American population, absorbed thousands of new arrivals who often found support through established Polish parishes and fraternal organizations. However, these newcomers, predominantly military veterans and political exiles, sometimes clashed with established Polish-American communities over issues of identity and politics. The new arrivals, having experienced the war directly and holding strong anti-communist views, often found American-born Poles insufficiently militant regarding Poland's political situation or too assimilated in their cultural practices. Canada, Australia, and Argentina also developed significant Polish exile communities, each with distinctive characteristics shaped by local conditions and immigration policies. In all these contexts, former Polish servicemen faced the challenge of balancing integration into their new societies with maintenance of Polish identity and continued engagement with Poland's political future. The Polish combatant organizations that formed in each country, often with direct lineage to wartime military units, became central institutions in these adaptation processes, providing not just practical assistance, but psychological continuity for men whose military service had defined their adult lives. Major Stefan Kowalski, whose moment of liberation began our narrative, eventually settled in Toronto, Canada, where he worked as a draftsman for an engineering firm while remaining active in Polish community organizations. Like many of his generation, he lived a divided existence, outwardly adapted to Canadian life, while inwardly oriented toward Poland and its struggles. He would not return to his homeland until 1976, 31 years after that rainy day in Frankfurt, when he had first confronted the painful reality of his situation. By then, his wife had died, never having left Poland, and his daughter, whom he had last seen as a 7-year-old in 1939, had grown to adulthood, married, and had children of her own, all under a political system Kowalski had refused to accept. Their reunion, which took place in a state-monitored hotel in Warsaw, under the watchful eyes of security services, embodied the personal cost of the historical forces that had separated them. "I would not recognize you on the street," his daughter told him, speaking carefully in a room they both assumed was bugged. "You are a stranger to me, though I have carried your photograph all these years." Kowalski, by then in his 70s, could offer no adequate response to this fundamental truth. The decision he had made 3 decades earlier, politically justified in his mind but emotionally devastating, had permanently altered the course of their lives. No brief visit could bridge that chasm. This personal dimension of the Polish military exile, the severed relationships, missed milestones, and parallel lives that could never be fully reconciled, represents perhaps the most profound aspect of their post-war experience. Beyond the political principles and material circumstances that shaped their decisions lay this intimate tragedy of separation. Captain Tomasz Wiśniewski, who settled in London after service with the Polish Parachute Brigade, expressed this aspect in a memoir published in 1983. History books will record our military exploits and the diplomatic betrayals that followed. But they cannot capture the letters never sent, the funerals unattended, the grandchildren unknown. We won medals in a war that cost us everything that gives meaning to victory. The children of these exiled servicemen grew up with complex relationships to Polish identity and history. Raised in British, American, Canadian, or Australian society, many maintained Polish language and cultural practices at their parents' insistence, while simultaneously adapting to their immediate social environments. Maria Kowalska-Thompson, daughter of a Polish Air Force pilot who settled in England, described this dual identity in a 1990 interview. Home was Poland in miniature, Polish spoken exclusively, Polish food, Polish newspapers, constant discussions of Polish politics. School and everything outside our front door was England. We children lived in translation, moving between these worlds daily. Our parents remained emigrants. We became immigrants, then eventually British, but with this inheritance of exile, we didn't fully understand. For the generation of Polish servicemen themselves, the Cold War decades brought a gradual transition from active exile characterized by political engagement and expectation of eventual return to permanent settlement abroad. As years passed and the Soviet grip on Eastern Europe showed no signs of weakening, pragmatic adaptation increasingly overshadowed revolutionary hopes. Veterans who had once devoted evenings and weekends to exile political activities increasingly focused on career advancement, children's education, and integration into their adoptive societies. The Polish military clubs and associations that had once functioned as quasi-military units in waiting gradually evolved into social and cultural organizations, though they maintained their symbolic connection to Poland's independence struggle. This evolution reflected both the practical necessities of aging and the psychological process of accepting a permanent displacement that had initially been conceived as temporary. Former Lieutenant Jan Kowalczyk, who had settled in Adelaide, Australia, after service with the Polish Carpathian Brigade, reflected on this transition in a letter to a comrade in 1972. When we arrived here in 47, we lived as if packed for immediate departure. Polish books only, Polish friends only, constant political meetings about liberation strategies. Now I have an Australian son-in-law, grandchildren who speak Polish poorly, if at all, and a house full of possessions I've accumulated over 25 years. Somehow, without consciously deciding, I have become permanently Australian while remaining eternally Polish. It is a strange state of being, at home, in exile. The question of return remained theoretically open throughout the communist period, though practical obstacles diminished with time. By the 1970s, the Polish government, seeking international legitimacy and hard currency, relaxed restrictions on visits by émigré Poles. Many veterans, by then approaching retirement age, made their first journeys back to Poland as tourists, experiencing the bittersweet reality of seeing familiar landscapes transformed by 3 decades of communist rule. These visits often confirmed their decision to remain abroad while simultaneously intensifying their emotional connection to the homeland. Former Captain Andrzej Majewski, who had built a successful accounting practice in Chicago after service with the Polish 1st Armored Division, described his first return visit in 1975. The moment the plane landed in Warsaw, I wept uncontrollably. The air smelled like home despite everything. Then came 2 weeks of contradictory emotions. Joy at seeing familiar streets and hearing Polish spoken everywhere. Anger at the visible poverty and oppression. Guilt at my relative prosperity. Relief that I had not subjected my children to this system. I returned to Chicago more certain than ever that my decision had been correct, yet more painfully aware of what that decision had cost me. This ambivalence characterized much of the Polish military diaspora's engagement with homeland throughout the communist period. Even as they maintained principled opposition to the regime, many exiles developed pragmatic approaches to maintaining family connections and supporting Polish society. Remittances to relatives became a significant economic factor, with Western currency providing access to otherwise unobtainable goods through special shops. Care packages containing coffee, chocolate, medicines, clothing, and other scarce items became a standard means of assistance, creating material links between divided families while highlighting the economic disparities between East and West. Nichts tun? Emergence of the Solidarity movement in 1980 and its subsequent suppression under martial law in December 1981 galvanized the aging Polish émigré communities. Veterans organizations that had been gradually transitioning toward primarily social functions suddenly reactivated their political networks, organizing material support for the opposition and information campaigns in their adoptive countries. Many elderly exiles saw in solidarity the vindication of their decades-long stance, proof that authentic Polish patriotism had survived communist indoctrination and that their preservationist efforts abroad had served a purpose. Former Sergeant Stanisław Nowicki, who had maintained an extensive correspondence with relatives in Poland throughout the 1970s, became a key liaison between Solidarity activists and Polish émigré organizations in London following the imposition of martial law. At 77, more than 40 years after his decision not to return to Communist Poland, he found himself once again engaged in clandestine activities, arranging shipments of printing equipment and financial support to underground operations. "History has come full circle," he wrote to a fellow veteran. "We who could not return are now helping those who remained to achieve what we left to preserve a truly independent Poland." The final vindication for the Polish military exile came with the collapse of communism in 1989 and Poland's subsequent transition to democracy. Veterans who had maintained their exile for more than 4 decades witnessed the realization of their core political objective, Poland's liberation from Soviet domination, though few had lived to see it. By 1989, the majority of World War II Polish servicemen had died or reached advanced age. For those who remained, the fall of communism presented a final, complex decision whether to return to a homeland now politically aligned with the principles for which they had maintained their exile, but socially and culturally transformed beyond recognition during their long absence. Some did return permanently, particularly those with surviving family connections. Former Lieutenant Colonel Józef Szymanski, who had commanded an artillery unit at Monte Cassino before settling in Manchester, England, moved back to his hometown of Lublin in 1991 at age 82. "I left when this street was rubble," he told a local newspaper. "I returned to find it rebuilt in ways I could never have imagined. It is still my street, but I am a stranger here." His experience epitomized the bittersweet quality of these late returns. The physical homeland recovered, but the social world of pre-war Poland irretrievably lost. Most veterans, however, chose to remain in their countries of settlement, where they had built decades of life and where children and grandchildren were fully integrated. For them, post-communist Poland represented not a destination, but a vindication, proof that their long exile had preserved something essential that could now be reintegrated into Poland's national development. Organizations like the Federation of Poles in Great Britain and the Polish-American Congress pivoted from opposition to cooperation, establishing programs to support Poland's democratic transition through educational exchanges, business development, and cultural initiatives. The new democratic Polish government, recognizing the historical significance of the military exile, moved to formally rehabilitate these veterans and acknowledge their contribution to Poland's independence struggle. In 1992, the Polish Parliament passed legislation restoring full citizenship rights to émigrés who had been stripped of them by communist authorities. Military ranks and decorations were formally recognized and, in many cases, additional honors conferred. President Lech Wałęsa, addressing a gathering of returning veterans in Warsaw in 1993, officially apologized for their decades of exile. Poland asks your forgiveness for the years of separation forced upon you by foreign powers and their collaborators. Your loyalty to the true Poland has been vindicated by history. For aging veterans, these gestures offered emotional closure, if not practical restitution. Major Kowalski, now in his 90s and too frail to travel from his home in Toronto, received his restored Polish passport and additional military decorations by diplomatic courier. His daughter, traveling from Warsaw for what would be their final meeting, brought Polish soil for his eventual grave. "You kept faith with a Poland that existed only in memory," she told him. Now that Poland remembers you, this reconciliation between homeland and diaspora represented not just a political resolution, but a philosophical one, an acknowledgement that both those who had stayed and those who had left had maintained aspects of Polish identity through different means and at different costs. The Poland that emerged from communism drew upon both these traditions, integrating the preservation of national culture that had occurred in exile with the everyday resistance that had sustained Polish identity at home under occupation and foreign domination. Today, as direct participants in this historical drama gradually disappear, their legacy remains complex and multifaceted. Military cemeteries across Western Europe contain thousands of Polish graves, men who fought for Poland's freedom but never returned to its soil. Archives in London, Paris, New York, Chicago, and other centers of Polish emigration preserve the records of their exile communities, the newspapers, meeting minutes, correspondence, and memoirs that document this distinctive historical experience. Meanwhile, in Poland itself, museums, memorials, and educational programs increasingly incorporate the story of the military exile, alongside narratives of domestic resistance, recognizing that Poland's path to contemporary independence followed multiple, interconnected trajectories. For families shaped by these historical forces, the consequences continue to reverberate across generations. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren of exiled servicemen raised in Britain, America, Canada, and elsewhere maintain varying degrees of connection to their Polish heritage. Some have reclaimed Polish citizenship under laws recognizing descendant rights, creating new transnational identities that bridge historical divisions. Others know their family's Polish origins as a distant biographical fact, its emotional significance dimmed by time and integration. Yet the fundamental question posed by Major Kowalski and his contemporaries on that rainy day in 1945, what constitutes home when nation, territory, and political identity become unmoored from one another, remains relevant in our age of global migration and political upheaval. The Polish military exile following World War II stands as a powerful reminder that victory and defeat are not always clearly distinguishable, that liberation can bring new forms of loss, and that the concept of home encompasses far more than geographic location. When commanders told Polish POWs, "You are free to go," they offered a freedom constrained by geopolitical realities that rendered its promise hollow for many. The whispered response, "We have no home," expressed a truth that would define not just individual lives, but Poland's national experience throughout the Cold War and beyond. That freedom without sovereignty is an incomplete liberty, and that home is not merely a place, but a complex constellation of political rights, cultural continuity, and personal belonging that can be fractured by the forces of history in ways no military victory alone can repair. Captain James Harrington stood motionless on the dusty parade ground of Camp Atterbury, Indiana, on May 7, 1946. The spring breeze ruffled the papers in his hand, release forms for the 37 Hungarian prisoners of war standing in formation before him. What should have been a straightforward repatriation ceremony had instead become something the 34-year-old officer would remember for the rest of his life. "I don't understand," he said, looking again at the translator. "Please tell them again." The translator, a Hungarian-American lieutenant named Kovács, repeated the announcement in Magyar. The response came back the same as before. 29 of the 37 men were refusing repatriation. They wanted to stay. They wanted to continue working in American factories, on American farms, in the land of their former enemy. Harrington had supervised enemy prisoners for 3 years now, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this moment. These men had endured captivity for nearly 2 years. Their homeland was finally free from war. Their families awaited their return. Yet here they stood, refusing the freedom papers in his outstretched hand. "Ask them why," Harrington ordered, struggling to keep the bewilderment from his voice. What Sergeant István Nemeth said next would haunt Harrington for decades. "Tell your commander that 2 days working in your factories taught us more about freedom than 20 years of speeches back home. We have seen what is possible now. We cannot unsee it." What Harrington witnessed that spring morning defied 4 years of wartime propaganda and centuries of European cultural conditioning. These men, former enemies, were choosing continued labor in America over returning to their homeland. The impossible had happened. Captivity in abundance had proven more desirable than freedom in scarcity. The Hungarian soldier's choice represented a profound revelation that would repeat itself thousands of times in the coming years. As prisoners from across Europe and later Asia encountered the shocking reality of American industrial and agricultural capacity, István Nemeth had been drafted into the Hungarian Second Army in 1942. Like most Hungarians of his generation, he had grown up hearing that the decadent Western democracies were failing states, corrupt, chaotic, and doomed to collapse under their own contradictions. The son of a railway worker from Debrecen, Nemeth had received a steady diet of propaganda about America, a land of stark inequalities, where a few wealthy capitalists lived in luxury, while the masses suffered in squalor. His school textbooks, revised after Hungary, allied with Nazi Germany, described Americans as soft, undisciplined, and incapable of victory against the disciplined forces of the European New Order. By 1944, as Soviet forces pushed toward Hungarian borders, Nemeth's unit was diverted to the Western Front, where they were quickly captured by American forces during the chaotic German retreat from France. After initial processing in temporary camps, Nemeth and approximately 37,000 other Hungarian prisoners were transported to the United States, distributed among hundreds of POW camps that dotted the American landscape from Maine to California. This massive movement of prisoners represented one of the largest wartime population transfers in history, bringing men raised in the scarcity of Central Europe into direct contact with the overwhelming abundance of wartime America. The contrast could not have been more stark. Hungary, a nation of 9 million people, had been depleting its agricultural and industrial capacity since 1941. By 1944, basic consumer goods had disappeared from Budapest shops. Bread was strictly rationed at 200 grams per person daily. Meat appeared on most family tables only once weekly, if at all. Clothing was patched and repatched. A simple pair of leather shoes cost 3 months' wages for the average worker, when they could be found at all. Meanwhile, America, with its 132 million citizens, was producing material at rates that seemed mathematically impossible to European observers. In 1943 alone, American factories produced over 300,000 aircraft engines, 86,000 tanks, and 2 million trucks and jeeps. This output occurred while simultaneously supplying its civilian population with consumer goods at levels that seemed obscene to European sensibilities. This industrial might was precisely what the Hungarian prisoners encountered, first with disbelief, then with dawning realization of its implications. Nemeth's first shock came during the Atlantic crossing. "They fed us white bread," he later wrote in a letter home. "White bread with butter and jam, every day. The same food the American guards ate." In Budapest, white flour had disappeared by 1942. Here they fed it to prisoners. But this initial surprise paled compared to what awaited the Hungarian prisoners when they reached American soil. At Camp Atterbury, where Nemeth was eventually stationed, the prisoners received 3 meals daily, totaling over 3,000 calories, more than most had ever consumed regularly in civilian life. The camp physician, Dr. Walter Richardson, documented in his quarterly report that the average Hungarian prisoner gained 14 pounds within 60 days of arrival. These men arrived exhibiting typical signs of European wartime nutrition, Richardson noted. Sunken cheeks, visible ribs, vitamin deficiencies. Within 2 months, most were at their optimal body weight or slightly above. Several asked if they were being overfed as some form of experimental treatment. They were not. They were simply receiving standard American military rations, slightly reduced from those provided to U.S. personnel. Food represented only the first revelation. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could be employed in non-war-related industries, and the acute American labor shortage meant prisoners' work was in high demand. Nemeth and 17 other Hungarians were assigned to the Richardson Furniture Factory in Columbus, Indiana, 15 miles from the camp. Here, the scale of operations delivered the second shock. The factory was larger than any I had seen in Hungary, Nemeth recorded in his camp journal, preserved now in the Smithsonian. They produced more chairs in one day than our largest furniture maker in Budapest could make in a month. And the wood, such quality and quantity. In Hungary, such materials would have been reserved for luxury goods for the very wealthy or government officials. Here they became ordinary dining chairs, selling for what converted to 2 weeks' Hungarian wages. The factory owner, Benjamin Richardson, had initially been reluctant to employ enemy prisoners. By the end of 6 months, he had requested more Hungarian workers specifically, noting their skill, reliability, and increasingly their innovative suggestions for production improvements. Lieutenant Joseph Kovács, the Hungarian-American translator assigned to Camp Atterbury, documented the prisoners' evolving reactions in his weekly reports. Initial attitude, suspicion, and disbelief, he wrote in August 1944. Prevalent theory among prisoners. They are being shown only the best facilities as propaganda. By October, growing realization that what they are witnessing is commonplace in America. By December, profound reassessment of pre-war beliefs about American capabilities. Kovács specifically noted the reaction when prisoners learned that the Richardson Furniture Factory, which to them seemed an industrial colossus, was considered merely a mid-sized regional producer, one of hundreds of similar operations across the country. This information produced visible distress in several prisoners, Kovács reported. Sergeant Ferenc Kovács, no relation, requested confirmation multiple times, believing he had misunderstood the translation. The revelations continued as the Hungarians were rotated through different work assignments. 23 prisoners, including István Nemeth, were temporarily assigned to the Thompson family farm outside Edinburgh, Indiana, during the 1945 harvest season. The Thompson farm covered 640 acres, modest by American standards, but larger than the collective holdings of most Hungarian villages. The level of mechanization proved particularly stunning to the Hungarian prisoners, many of whom came from agricultural backgrounds. The farm operated 7 tractors, 3 mechanical harvesters, and a fleet of trucks. In my village, prisoner Laszlo Nagy told the farm owner's son, we share 2 tractors among 43 families. You have more machines than our entire collective. Nagy stood speechless when shown the farm's storage silos, containing more grain in reserve than his entire home district produced annually. When Robert Thompson casually mentioned that his teenage son would attend university the following year, a mechanical engineering program at Purdue, the prisoners exchanged glances. Higher education for a farmer's son? This single detail contradicted everything they had been told about class stratification in America. Perhaps the most profound shock came not from the scale of production, but from everyday encounters with abundance, taken for granted by Americans. Prisoner János Fehér recorded his astonishment when the Richardsons' 10-year-old daughter, visiting her father's factory, casually discarded a partially eaten apple. In Hungary, Fehér wrote, that apple core would have been carefully preserved. the seeds planted, the remaining flesh stewed for preserves. Here, a child throws it away without thought. I suddenly understood something fundamental about America. They waste casually what we treasure desperately. Another prisoner, working in Camp Atterbury's massive laundry facility, noted that the Americans used separate machines for washing and drying clothes, an unimaginable luxury. We stood there watching these enormous machines cleaning hundreds of uniforms, wrote Corporal Mihaly Barta. 1 hour of operation used more soap than my mother could obtain in 6 months in Budapest. And the water, hot water in such quantities, used just for washing clothes. Ukraine. Simple observations accumulated into a devastating portrait. America's wartime standard of living exceeded Hungary's peacetime prosperity. And this while America was fully engaged in a two-front global war. Dr. Andor Kesmarki, a captured Hungarian medical officer assigned to assist in the camp infirmary, provided perhaps the most systematic documentation of the psychological impact. With permission from camp authorities, Kesmarki conducted informal interviews with 50 Hungarian prisoners over 8 months, tracking their evolving perceptions. Initial reaction universally one of disbelief, he wrote in his first report in September 1944. Subjects believe they are witnessing elaborate deception. By the 3-month mark, 70% have accepted that what they are seeing is genuine. By 6 months, this reaches 98%. The remaining 2% demonstrate significant psychological distress and cling to previous worldview despite mounting evidence. Kesmarki specifically noted the moment of revelation for many prisoners, discovering that ordinary American workers owned automobiles. This single fact, he wrote, contradicted so many aspects of what they had been taught about American society that it forced a complete reevaluation. In Hungary, even before the war, a private automobile represented extraordinary wealth. Here, factory workers drive to work daily. The camp's monthly cultural orientation films, intended to prevent workplace misunderstandings, inadvertently delivered further shocks. A film explaining typical American household appliances left the Hungarian prisoners in stunned silence. Electric refrigerators, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, devices they had been told were rare luxuries owned by only the wealthiest Americans, were shown as commonplace. The film's narrator casually mentioned that over 60% of American households owned refrigerators before production shifted to war materials. The film, produced as a basic orientation for interacting with American families, unintentionally functioned as a devastating rebuttal to years of propaganda. After one screening, prisoner Bela Kerestes approached Lieutenant Kovacs. "We were told America was on the verge of collapse," he said quietly, "that its wealth was an illusion sustained by Jewish bankers. Now I understand our leaders didn't lie to us about America. They couldn't tell us the truth because they had never seen it themselves. They described a fantasy America because the real one was beyond their comprehension." As months passed, the prisoners' letters home, heavily censored by both American and eventually Hungarian authorities, attempted to convey their discoveries. István Németh wrote to his brother in October 1945, "You won't believe me until you see it yourself. The Americans produce more steel in Pittsburgh than our entire country produces in a year. Their agricultural output in just the state of Indiana exceeds all of Hungary. And the most incredible part, this abundance flows to ordinary people. The factory manager and the factory worker both have automobiles, different models, yes, but both have them. Both have refrigerators, both have wardrobes full of clothes. The difference is in degree, not in kind." Such letters, when they reached Hungary at all, were often dismissed by recipients as the result of coercion or propaganda. Some families wrote back concerned that their imprisoned relatives had succumbed to psychological manipulation. The truth was far simpler. The prisoners were describing exactly what they saw. By early 1946, as repatriation became possible with the war's end, American authorities began processing prisoners for return to their homelands. German, Italian, and other Axis prisoners were generally eager to return home despite the uncertain conditions awaiting them. the Hungarian contingent proved different. When Captain Harrington announced repatriation plans to the Hungarian prisoners at Camp Atterbury, the response was not universal relief, but visible ambivalence. During individual processing interviews, 29 of the 37 Hungarians at Atterbury expressed reluctance to return. Among them was István Németh, who told Harrington through the translator, "I have younger brothers at home. If I stay here, I can send them more for my wages in 1 month than they would earn in 6 months in Hungary. More importantly, I can tell them the truth about what exists beyond our borders." Another prisoner, Ferenc Takacs, was even more direct. "I have seen how Americans live. I have seen what is possible. To return now would be to choose ignorance over knowledge, scarcity over abundance. I cannot make that choice." The legal framework of the time did not easily accommodate such requests. International agreements mandated repatriation of prisoners. Camp authorities initially insisted all prisoners must return to their countries of origin, where they could then apply for potential emigration through normal channels. This position softened as the Cold War tensions emerged and Soviet influence expanded in Eastern Europe. By late 1946, American policy adapted to allow certain prisoners to remain in the United States or relocate to other Western nations rather than return to Soviet-controlled territories. This shift came too late for the Atterbury Hungarians, who had already been repatriated by then. However, their story was repeated at other camps across America, where Hungarian, Romanian, and eventually even Soviet prisoners attempted to resist repatriation after experiencing American abundance. The most comprehensive documentation of this phenomenon comes from Camp Shanks in New York, where Major William Hoffman supervised the repatriation of 93 Hungarian prisoners in August 1946. Hoffman, with a background in psychology, recognized the historical significance of what was occurring and conducted exit interviews with all prisoners, both those accepting and those resisting repatriation. The consistent thread, Hoffman wrote in his report to the War Department, is the devastating impact of witnessing American productive capacity firsthand. These men arrived as committed enemies, convinced of our decadence and inevitable defeat. They depart either as reluctant returnees or would-be Americans. I cannot overstate the psychological transformation evident in these interviews. Hoffman specifically noted the case of Lieutenant Karli Varga, the highest-ranking Hungarian officer at Camp Shanks. Varga, from an aristocratic Hungarian family and educated at German universities, had been the most ideologically committed to the Axis cause upon arrival. By 1946, he was among the most determined to remain in America. "What changed you?" Hoffman asked directly. Varga's response was included verbatim in Hoffman's report: mathematics. The production numbers made Hungarian and German victory mathematically impossible. "When I saw American factories producing more aircraft in a week than Hungary could build in a year, I understood our defeat was inevitable from the beginning. We were not defeated by superior tactics or fighting spirit. We were defeated by blast furnaces and assembly lines and oil fields, by refrigerators and automobiles, by the casual abundance that makes Americans soft in peacetime and unstoppable in war." The raw statistics support Varga's assessment. In 1944 alone, at the peak of wartime production, American factories produced more than 96,000 aircraft, nearly 270 per day. Hungary's entire aircraft production for the duration of the war totaled fewer than 1,000 planes. American shipyards launched more than 5,500 naval vessels during the war years. Hungary, a landlocked nation, had no significant naval production, but even Germany, with its vaunted efficiency, produced fewer than 1,000 naval vessels during the same period. The disparity extended to every category of production: tanks, artillery, small arms, ammunition, vehicles, radio equipment, medicine, uniforms, preserved food. Economist Walter Thompson, in his 1947 analysis of wartime production, calculated that the United States outproduced the combined Axis powers by a ratio of 3-to-1 across all military goods, while simultaneously maintaining civilian production at nearly 80% of pre-war levels. For the Hungarian prisoners, witnessing even a small portion of this production capacity firsthand delivered a psychological blow more devastating than military defeat. Laszlo Kertész, a 23-year-old corporal captured in France in 1944, described his experience at Camp Cook in California in a series of journals later donated to the Hungarian National Museum. Assigned to work at the Santa Barbara Citrus Cooperative, Kertész documented his progressive realizations with remarkable clarity. "First day at the American farm," he wrote. "They have more tractors in this one operation than exist in my entire district at home. The workers complain that they are using older equipment because new tractors are unavailable during the war. These old machines would be considered miraculous in Hungary." 2 weeks later, he observed, "The amount of fruit rejected for minor blemishes exceeds our total fruit distribution in Budapest. Food considered unfit for market here would be treasured delicacies at home." By his third month, Kertész was documenting wider realizations. "The cooperative manager showed me his home today, a modest house by local standards. It contains more living space than my entire apartment building in Budapest. His kitchen has running hot water, electric refrigeration, and automatic cooking devices. His wife has never carried water from a well or cooked on a wood stove. This is not unusual here. This is normal." Perhaps most significantly, Kertész noted, the workers at the cooperative own automobiles, not the managers, the ordinary field workers. They drive to work, they drive to shopping, they drive to entertainment. The mobility this represents is beyond comprehension to someone from my background. Similar accounts emerged from camps across America. At Fort Robinson, Nebraska, Hungarian prisoners working at a meat processing plant recorded their astonishment at both the scale of operations and the living standards of the American workers. "The plant processes more cattle in one day than my town sees in a year," wrote Sergeant Gabor Fekete. "Mais requiert secundara." The workers eat meat daily, often for multiple meals. They complain about the quality of cuts available during wartime rationing, unaware that what they consider restricted would be feast day fare in Hungary. At Camp Breckenridge in Kentucky, prisoners assigned to coal mining operations noted that American miners owned their own homes, sent their children to high school, and expected them to attend college. "The American worker lives better than Hungarian professionals," prisoner Imre Szigeti wrote to his family. "Their miners earn more than our doctors. Their farmers live better than our government officials. And none of this is propaganda. I have seen their homes, eaten at their tables, witnessed their daily lives. The abundance extended beyond consumer goods into infrastructural and institutional capacities that left the Hungarian prisoners equally stunned." Zander Kovacs, a prisoner at Camp Wheeler in Georgia, described his reaction to the camp's medical facilities. "The hospital for prisoners contains more beds, more equipment, and more medicine than the regional hospital that serves my entire district in Hungary. American doctors use antibiotics casually for infections we would treat with home remedies and prayer. They have diagnostic machines I had only read about in medical journals. Similarly, prisoners assigned to educational programs during captivity encountered libraries and educational resources that dwarfed what had been available in their homeland. The camp library for recreational reading contains more books than my town's entire collection," wrote Joseph Varga from Camp McCain in Mississippi. "The vocational training workshop has newer equipment than our technical college in Budapest." Such discoveries forced profound reassessment of pre-war assumptions about American society and capabilities. Perhaps most disturbing to the Hungarian prisoners' worldview was the casual wastefulness they witnessed in American operations. Istvan Horvath, working at a munitions plant in Michigan, recorded his shock at seeing damaged equipment discarded rather than repaired. "In Hungary, we would have spent days repairing these machines," he wrote. "Here, they replace them immediately. Time is more valuable than materials." At Camp Polk in Louisiana, prisoners assigned to quartermaster operations watched as slightly damaged uniforms and boots were declared surplus and removed from circulation. The boots they consider unusable would sell for a month's wages in Budapest, Antal Széchenyi noted in his journal. I asked why they do not repair them. The quartermaster looked confused. The cost of repair exceeds the cost of replacement, he explained. This single answer contains an entire economic philosophy foreign to European thinking. This fundamentally different relationship to material goods, where human labor was expensive and physical, resources relatively abundant, inverted the economic assumptions the Hungarians had grown up with. The cumulative psychological impact of these revelations proved profound. Dr. Kaczmarski, continuing his informal study of the Hungarian prisoners, documented distinct phases in their psychological adjustment. Initial phase, disbelief and denial. Secondary phase, depression and sense of betrayal regarding previous beliefs. Third phase, curiosity and intense information gathering. Final phase, psychological reorganization around new understanding of world economic order. This pattern repeated across prisoner groups, regardless of education level or pre-war political affiliation. The speed of transition varied. Some prisoners moved through the entire process in months. Others required more than a year, but the progression remained consistent. By the time repatriation became possible, most had completed this psychological journey, arriving at what Kaczmarski termed irreversible cognitive transformation. In plainer language, they could not unlearn what they had witnessed. Colonel Thomas Whitaker, commanding officer of the Camp Atterbury complex, summarized the situation in his March 1946 report to the War Department. "We are witnessing an unprecedented phenomenon among the Hungarian prisoner contingent. Having observed American productive capacity directly, these men are now reluctant to return to their homeland despite the end of hostilities and the resumption of civilian transportation. Their stated reasoning is consistent. They have witnessed an economic reality that fundamentally contradicts their previous worldview. To return home means either living a lie or attempting to explain the unexplainable to populations who have not shared their observations. Neither option appeals to them." Whitaker specifically noted that this reluctance crossed educational and class boundaries. This is not limited to the educated or professional classes who might be expected to make more objective assessments. Some of our most determined would-be Americans come from rural, minimally educated backgrounds. The evidence of American abundance has proven more persuasive than any propaganda from either side. The testimony of the prisoners themselves, preserved in letters, journals, and interview transcripts, reveals the personal dimension of this collective revelation. István Nemeth, writing in what he believed would be a private journal, captured the sense of vertigo induced by his American experience. "Everything I was taught about the world has proven false, not merely wrong in details, but fundamentally, comprehensively false. America is not what we were told. Capitalism is not what we were told. Democracy is not what we were told. The discrepancy is so vast that I question everything I have ever learned. If they lied about this or were so profoundly mistaken, what else might be untrue? This question haunts my every waking moment." Corporal Mihaly Nagy expressed similar sentiments in a letter to his brother, never sent due to censorship concerns. "I wish you could see what I have seen. It would answer every question you ever had about why we lost this war. We were not fighting a nation. We were fighting a continent disguised as a nation, with resources beyond comprehension and production capacity beyond calculation. The miracle is not that we lost. The miracle is that we dared to fight at all." For many prisoners, the revelation extended beyond military or economic reassessment into profound personal crisis. Lieutenant Geza Molnar, a teacher in civilian life, wrote in his journal, "I have spent 15 years teaching children about the decadent, failing American system. I believed what I taught. Now I discover that I was spreading falsehoods, however unwittingly. How do I return to my classroom? What do I tell my students? That everything in their textbooks about America is a lie? That their teacher was a fool?" Similarly, Sergeant Ferenc Kovács, who had been a minor government official before the war, questioned his entire career. I helped implement policies based on assumptions about Western economies that I now know to be completely false. The 5-year plans, the production quotas, the resource allocations, all were predicated on economic theories that America disproves by its mere existence. My life's work has been building on sand. By the time Captain Harrington stood on the parade ground at Camp Atterbury, with repatriation papers in hand, the Hungarian prisoners had spent nearly 2 years witnessing American abundance firsthand. Their refusal to repatriate represented the culmination of this extended revelation, a final definitive rejection of their previous understanding of the world. For 29 of the 37 men, the prospect of returning to Soviet-dominated Hungary, with its economic hardships and ideological constraints, had become less appealing than remaining in the land of their former enemy. "We are not rejecting our homeland," István Nemeth told Harrington through the translator. "We are choosing a future over a past. We are choosing reality over illusion." This sentiment echoed across prisoner camps throughout America, as repatriation processes revealed similar reluctance among Hungarian, Romanian, and later Soviet prisoners. Despite these objections, international agreements initially required repatriation of all prisoners to their countries of origin. The Atterbury Hungarians were returned to Hungary in June 1946, along with most Hungarian prisoners from other American camps. Their subsequent experiences reveal the lasting impact of their American revelations. Of the 29 who had resisted repatriation, 23 would eventually flee Hungary during the 1946 to 1956 period, with the largest exodus occurring during the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. Among these was István Nemeth, who escaped to Austria during the Revolution and eventually immigrated to the United States in 1957, settling in Cleveland, Ohio. 11 years, he wrote to Captain Harrington, with whom he had maintained correspondence. "It took 11 years, but I have returned to the land that showed me what was possible." The impact of the Hungarian prisoners' American experience extended far beyond their personal journeys. Those who remained in Hungary became conduits for information about American economic capabilities, sharing their observations despite official disapproval. Some found themselves under surveillance by Hungarian security services, suspected of harboring pro-Western sympathies. Others deliberately muted their accounts, sharing their knowledge only with trusted family members. Yet the information spread, contributing to the growing awareness within the Eastern Bloc of the vast economic disparity between East and West. Ferenc Varga, who had returned to his position as a machinist in a Budapest factory, later recalled, "We became unwitting spies, but not of military secrets. We carried the secret of American refrigerators, American automobiles, American supermarkets. In some ways, this knowledge proved more dangerous to the system than any military intelligence." The Hungarian experience was not unique. Similar patterns emerged among other Eastern European prisoners who witnessed American abundance firsthand. Romanian prisoners at Camp Van Dorn, Mississippi, Japanese prisoners at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, and eventually even Soviet prisoners from camps in England who glimpsed Western economies all reported comparable psychological transformations. Major William Hoffman, who continued studying this phenomenon after the war, wrote in his 1952 book, The Economics of Revelation, "The most effective weapon in the Cold War arsenal may not be military hardware or even nuclear deterrence, but simply the demonstration effect of Western economic systems. When Eastern Bloc citizens directly witness Western abundance, no counter-propaganda can fully preserve their previous beliefs. The effect is immediate, profound, and largely irreversible." In the decades following World War II, this dynamic would repeat itself through various channels. East German citizens viewing West German television broadcasts, Soviet officials given limited access to Western consumer societies, Eastern Bloc athletes traveling to international competitions in the West. Each exposure created cognitive dissonance that official explanations struggled to resolve. The Hungarian prisoners simply represented one of the earliest and most dramatic examples of this pattern, enemy soldiers who became economic witnesses, carrying home evidence that contradicted foundational assumptions of their societies. As Cold War tensions solidified into seemingly permanent global division, the testimony of these witnesses, however muted by distance and censorship, contributed to the persistent awareness within Eastern Bloc. Populations that alternative economic realities existed beyond their borders. The long-term trajectories of the Hungarian prisoners who eventually reached Western nations reveal the lasting impact of their wartime revelations. István Nemeth, settling in Cleveland, became part of a substantial Hungarian-American community. Like many former prisoners, he found work in manufacturing, eventually becoming a supervisor at Fisher Body, a General Motors division. "The irony was not lost on me," he later wrote in his memoir. "From Hungarian prisoner working in American industry to American supervisor, managing American workers. The difference was I appreciated the miracle of the system in ways my American-born colleagues could not." Nemeth and others like him brought a unique perspective to their adopted country, an outsider's appreciation for systems and capabilities that natives took for granted. Many former prisoners, when interviewed decades later, expressed similar sentiments. Americans never understood their own country, Ferenc Kovács observed in a 1987 interview. They complained about flaws in a system whose fundamental strengths they could not see because they had never experienced the alternative. The story of the Hungarian prisoners represents more than a historical curiosity. It illuminates a recurring pattern in ideological confrontations, the power of direct observation to overcome even the most entrenched beliefs. In Camp Atterbury, Indiana, on that spring day in 1946, Captain James Harrington witnessed more than a peculiar prisoner reaction. He observed the moment when reality overwhelmed ideology, when direct experience rendered propaganda obsolete. The Hungarian prisoners who stood before him refusing repatriation papers had completed a journey more profound than their physical transportation from Europe to America. They had traveled from one understanding of the world to another, from one set of certainties to their contradiction. This journey would be repeated countless times throughout the Cold War, as cracks in the information barriers between East and West allowed similar revelations to penetrate communist societies. 7 decades later, the psychological pattern documented by Dr. Kaczmarski among the Hungarian prisoners continues to manifest whenever populations raised in scarcity encounter abundance, whenever citizens of controlled economies experience market societies, whenever propaganda collides with observable reality. The 37 Hungarians who stood on the parade ground at Camp Atterbury were among the first documented cases of this phenomenon, enemy soldiers transformed by witness into reluctant admirers, prisoners who, when finally offered freedom, responded with history's most ironic reply, "We'd rather stay."